Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and welcome to the Practical Stoic Bites podcast. So today what I want to do is I actually want to continue to look into the first book of Meditations, because I'm studying it at the moment, and I think that there's a lot that we can get out of here that we can use to help us to really define our own clear personal ideal. Because, as you remember from the last episode, I encouraged you to go away and write down some of the characteristics that you would like to embody within yourself that you see in other incredible people around you. And what's really interesting about this first book of Meditations, where he's doing this, is not only should it encourage us to, go and do that for ourselves, look at the incredible examples that we see in other people, but what we can get here is a really clear picture of exactly the kind of person who Marcus Aurelius wanted to be. And if you think about that, that's an incredible resource to have. We literally have the exact personal ideal that Marcus Aurelius set for himself, that he was trying to live up to, right? And so if it's good enough for Marcus Aurelius, then it's probably good enough for us. And so what I wanted to do over the next few episodes, I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of these principles that he's trying to embody, and maybe encourage you to add these to your own personal ideal. And then once I'm finished with this first book and we've gone through a few of the really important points, then I'm also going to put together a post on my website with exactly the personal ideal that Marcus Aurelius set out for himself. And so breaking it down into the very specific points, the very specific characteristics that he wanted to embody. And when you look at that, you'll be able to get a really clear picture of really who this incredible emperor was trying to live up to, which is a great resource to have again. So today, what I wanted to do was talk about one of the things that I found in his little, little blurb about his mother, right? And so he said, his mother, her reverence for the divine, her generosity, and here's the part that I want to focus on, her inability not only to do wrong, but even to conceive of doing it, right? And then he goes on and says, and the simple way that she lived, not in the least like the rich. But I really want to focus on that one part, her inability to not only do wrong, but to even conceive of doing it. Now that's an absolutely incredible praise to put on his mother, right? And obviously there's a little bit of exaggeration there. Like, we all have to agree, it has to be, at least in practice, impossible to live a life that is purely virtuous. That's what the Stoics talked about with the sage, right? The sage was somebody it was achievable to be a sage in theory, but in practice, that's the point of an ideal. It's supposed to be so good, so incredible that, look, even though you can't achieve it, it still doesn't mean that you don't go after it, right? And so the sage was somebody who not only didn't do unvirtuous acts, right? But they didn't even conceive of doing unvirtuous acts. And this goes right back to even Aristotle and the way that he taught virtue, right? Which was to do the right action in the right state of mind, right? So it wasn't just enough to apologize to somebody because you knew that if you didn't, then they would be angry at you. You had to apologize, and you had to want to apologize to that person because you knew that that was the only right thing to do. Now, obviously, there's sometimes when you don't have to apologize because that's not the right thing to do, right? But that's just an example. And so when he's heaping this praise on his mother and saying that she was the kind of person who, not only did no wrong, but wouldn't even conceive of doing it, that's high praise and a little bit exaggerated, but it's still a beautiful ideal to try and live up to. And so when we look at these kind of ideals, I've really got two questions for you. The first question is, A, is it achievable, right? And I think we can all agree that based on experience and based on seeing the people around us, it's probably impossible to become the kind of person who not only doesn't do wrong, but also doesn't even conceive of doing wrong. But my second question to you is this. If it is unachievable, which we can all agree in practice it probably is, if it is unachievable, does that mean that you don't try? Just because something is an ideal, just because something is so far out there, so ahead of us, that it's probably impossible to achieve, does that mean that we don't set it as our aim, set it as our goal, and go after it? I would argue that we make this kind of irrational judgment so many times in our lives. You know, I've dealt with clients before, and we've had kind of breakthroughs because I've had my clients come to me and say, well, I got home after a long day of work, and I knew that I had to go for example, like a 10-kilometer run, or I knew that I had to do my journaling, but I just didn't feel like it. I didn't have the time, and I knew that it wasn't going to be good. And I kind of said to my client, well, what makes you think that doing a 1-kilometer run isn't better than doing no run? And what I mean by this is, we make these judgments and we say it has to be all or nothing, and that we do this with every single area of our life, and we do this with our goals. So for example, if you get home after a long day of work and you knew that you'd planned to go for a 10-kilometer run, but you really only have time to maybe go for a 2-kilometer run, we'll often say, well, I can't do the 10-kilometer, so I'm just not going to do it, right? But I would argue that 2 kilometers is way better than nothing, right? And it's the same with our personal ideal. You set your personal ideal not so that you can absolutely achieve everything, but so that you have something that will constantly inspire you to be better, constantly inspire you to aim at a higher level than where you are right now. And just because something might be in practice unachievable doesn't mean that we don't go after it, because halfway to perfection is always better than not even trying in the first place. And so when I read that he wrote this about his mother, her inability not only to do wrong, but not to conceive of doing it, I thought, wow, that's a great lesson there. He's setting goals that are so out there, so unachievable, but he still wrote it down because it's so important to set something that will inspire you every single time to be better, to act better, to live in a more virtuous way. And so I would encourage you, as you're thinking about the incredible people in your life, as you're thinking about your own personal ideal and the exact kind of person who you want to be, really have a think about whether it needs to be a perfectly achievable goal or not, right? Because there is a lot of power in having that unachievable, unattainable goal that will always inspire us to lift ourselves up, right? It doesn't have to be achievable. It just has to be something that inspires you to be better in every single moment. And so, again, have a think about that one. Maybe even add it to your list of personal ideals, your personal philosophy for your life. I would love to become the kind of person who not only does no wrong, but doesn't even conceive of doing it. And just because that's an unattainable thing doesn't mean that it's not useful. That will inspire you every single time. And so I hope that this episode's been helpful. Next time I'm going to go through even more of Marcus Aurelius's personal ideal, or the beautiful characteristics that he wanted to embody. And I'll talk to you then. But I hope that this episode has helped you on your rise to the good life. Ciao. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practical Stoic Bites podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, then please subscribe and make sure you leave a positive review. Also, I'd love to invite you to join our Facebook group. It's called the Practical Stoic Mastermind. There you can get heaps of helpful tips, and you can keep up to date with everything that's happening with the show. Finally, if you'd like some help redefining or moving closer to your ideal life, then head to simonjedrew.com/coaching.